The notice was taped to the garage door on a Tuesday morning, and it didn't even have his name on it. Marcus Webb had arrived at 6:15, the way he always did, before the noise of the world had a chance to settle in, before the traffic thickened on Route 9, before anyone else in the industrial park had switched on a single fluorescent light. He carried two things: a thermos of black coffee and a folded paper bag with a peanut butter sandwich his 8-year-old daughter Lily had made for him the night before. She had pressed it flat with her small palm, the way she'd seen him press gaskets, and told him that it would seal in the flavor. He had laughed the kind of laugh that lives only between a father and a child, quiet, warm, and worth more than any salary. He had run Webb Precision Components out of that garage for 11 years. The space was modest. 4 bays, a concrete floor stained with decades of honest work, 2 lathes he had rebuilt himself, and a CNC milling machine he'd bought secondhand from a closed tool shop in Michigan and restored over 6 weekends while Lily slept. The garage was not beautiful. It was not impressive to anyone who measured the world in square footage or stock options. But the parts that came out of that garage, the microtolerance components, the custom aerospace brackets, the hydraulic fittings that fit within 3/1000ths of an inch, those were beautiful. Engineers who knew what they were looking at knew it. The parts spoke for themselves, the way all honest work eventually does. The notice did not speak honestly. It was printed on the letterhead of Callaway Industrial Group, the conglomerate that had, 8 months earlier, quietly purchased the 3 companies that together made up 90% of Marcus's client base. At the time, the acquisition had been reported in a trade journal as a strategic consolidation of regional manufacturing assets. Marcus had read the article once, folded the journal, and gone back to work. He was not a man who borrowed trouble before it arrived. But trouble had arrived now. On a Tuesday, taped to his door with 2 strips of blue painter's tape. The letter informed him, in the clean, bloodless language that corporations use when they want to ruin a man without looking at him, that Callaway Industrial Group had completed an internal vendor review and would be transitioning to centralized, in-house component production effective 30 days from the date of the letter. All outstanding invoices would be honored. No further orders would be placed. The letter closed with a sentence that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "We thank you for your past contributions and wish you continued success in your future endeavors." There was no signature, just a printed name, R. Callaway, Chief Executive Officer, and below it, a corporate seal that looked like it had been stamped by a machine that had never once touched anything made by hand. Marcus stood in the cold morning air and read the letter twice. Not because he hadn't understood it the first time, but because some part of him was waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. He folded the letter, slid it into the chest pocket of his work jacket, next to the paper bag with Lily's sandwich. Then he unlocked the garage, switched on the lights, and stood in the silence of the space he had built. Really stood in it the way a man stands in a room he knows he is about to lose. He looked at the lathes. He looked at the milling machine with the replaced spindle bearing he'd machined himself. He looked at the wall where Lily had taped a crayon drawing 2 years ago. A picture of a man in a garage surrounded by silver circles she called Dad's important rings. He had never taken it down. He didn't cry. That is important to understand. Not because he was performing strength, not because he was suppressing something that needed to come out, but because the grief he felt in that moment was too large and too old for tears. It was the grief of a man who had already lost one thing: his marriage, his children's intact home, the version of his life he had planned, and had rebuilt carefully, quietly, on ground he thought was solid. And now the ground had moved again. He poured his coffee. He sat on the metal stool by the first lathe. And he thought about Lily, who was at school right now, drawing things and trusting him completely. That was the moment the CEO took everything from Marcus Webb. It was also, though neither of them knew it yet, the moment Marcus Webb began. Marcus Webb did not grow up believing the world owed him anything. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. Not as a businessman, not as a father, but as a man. He had been raised in a 2-bedroom house in a small Ohio town where his father worked the line at a stamping plant for 31 years and never once complained about it in front of his children. His father believed that work was not something you discussed. You did it. You did it well. And when you came home, you left it at the door, because the people inside the house deserved the version of you that wasn't tired. Marcus had absorbed that lesson so completely that it had become indistinguishable from his character. He had been a quiet child, the kind teachers describe as thoughtful, which is often a polite way of saying he didn't perform his intelligence for anyone. He took things apart. Clocks, radios, a neighbor's broken lawnmower that he'd been given permission to dismantle at age 10 and had reassembled, to the neighbor's genuine astonishment, by age 11. He didn't do it to impress anyone. He did it because the interior of a machine was, to him, a kind of language, precise, logical, without pretense. Machines didn't exaggerate. Machines didn't tell you one thing and mean another. A tolerance was either held or it wasn't. A bearing either ran true or it didn't. He found that honesty profoundly comforting in a world that seemed, increasingly, to traffic in impression and noise. He studied mechanical engineering on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. He graduated without ceremony. No family trip, no celebratory dinner, because his father had passed the previous winter and his mother was managing the kind of quiet grief that doesn't announce itself. Marcus accepted his diploma, drove home, and the next morning began sending out applications. He was hired within 3 weeks by a mid-sized aerospace components firm in Columbus, where he spent 7 years learning the kind of precision manufacturing that cannot be taught in a classroom, the feel of a correctly calibrated machine, the sound a tool makes when it is cutting true, the difference between a part that meets spec on paper and a part that will hold under real-world stress. He was good. Genuinely, uncommonly good. His supervisor at the time, a veteran machinist named Don Heller who had spent 40 years in the trade, told Marcus once, just once because Don was not a man who repeated compliments, that he had the rarest quality a machinist could possess. He could feel when something was wrong before the instruments confirmed it. That instinct, Don said, could not be taught. Either you had it or you didn't. Marcus had it. He left the firm at 31, not out of ambition in the conventional sense, but out of necessity dressed in opportunity. His daughter Lily had just turned 1. His marriage to Claire had been unraveling for longer than either of them had admitted, stretched thin by financial pressure, by the long hours Marcus worked, by the distance that grows between 2 people when one of them processes the world inward and the other needs words to feel loved. The divorce, when it came, was not dramatic. It was simply sad, the specific sadness of 2 people who had genuinely tried and had arrived, exhausted, at the conclusion that trying was no longer enough. The custody arrangement gave Marcus Lily every other week. Then, as Claire's work schedule shifted, more and more frequently. By the time Lily was 3, she was with Marcus 4 nights out of 7. By the time she was 5, she had begun to call his garage our workshop, because she had a small stool in the corner, and a set of safety glasses he had painted pink at her request, and a standing invitation to watch him work whenever she wanted. She rarely asked questions. She mostly just watched, with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who is absorbing something she doesn't yet have words for. Marcus had opened Web Precision Components with $11,000. Most of it saved, some of it borrowed from his mother, who had pressed the envelope into his hand and told him not to thank her, just to do good work. His first client was a small hydraulics company whose regular supplier had failed a quality inspection. Marcus had turned around the order in 6 days and delivered parts that exceeded spec by a margin that made the company's lead engineer call him directly to ask how. Marcus had said simply that he'd machined them the way they needed to be machined. He built his reputation the only way he knew how, 1 order at a time, without shortcuts, without inflating his capabilities, without promising what he couldn't deliver. He was never the cheapest option. He was always the most reliable one. His clients were small to mid-sized firms, the kind of companies that couldn't afford catastrophic failure and therefore prized precision above everything else. He became, in that specific world, quietly irreplaceable. And then Callaway Industrial Group had come along, not to partner with those companies, not to grow them, but to absorb them, to extract their client lists and their contracts and their margins, and to discard everything that couldn't be entered into a spreadsheet. Everything that was relational. Everything that was human. Marcus had not been naive. He had understood, intellectually, that consolidation was a feature of modern industry. But understanding a thing and living through it are different experiences entirely. He sat in his garage that Tuesday morning, and he thought about his father, who had worked 31 years for a company that had given him a plaque and a handshake when he retired. He thought about Don Heller, who had spent 4 decades building knowledge that a new ownership group had deemed redundant in a single quarterly review. And he thought about Lily, who had pressed a sandwich flat with her small palm and told him it would hold. He decided it would. Richard Calloway had not been born cruel. That distinction matters, because the most dangerous antagonists in any man's life are rarely the ones who wake up intending to cause harm. They are the ones who cause harm as a byproduct of ambition so consuming that it has simply ceased to register other people as fully real. Richard had grown up in Connecticut, the second son of a man who ran a mid-sized logistics company with moderate success and a moderate pride. He had attended the right schools, developed the right vocabulary, and learned, as certain environments teach certain children, that the measure of a man was not the quality of what he built but the scale of what he controlled. He had an MBA from a school whose name opened doors without requiring further explanation. He had a talent for financial architecture, for seeing companies not as collections of people and purposes, but as structures of cost and yield that could be reorganized like furniture into more efficient configurations. He was, by every metric his world recognized, successful. His company had grown from a regional distributor to a multi-sector industrial conglomerate in less than a decade. He was profiled in trade publications as a decisive consolidator and a clear-eyed restructuring strategist. He wore those descriptions without irony. He had framed one of the articles, not out of vanity, exactly, but out of the belief that documentation of achievement was a form of accountability. He kept score because keeping score was how he knew he was winning. He had never spent a day on a factory floor. This is not an accusation. It is simply a fact, and facts have consequences. Richard understood manufacturing the way a man understands a foreign country from a well-researched travel guide. Accurately in the broad strokes, completely blind to the texture. He knew production volumes. He knew defect rates as percentages. He knew labor costs per unit and overhead ratios and the quarterly yield improvements that his analysts projected when a vendor was replaced by in-house production. What he did not know, could not know, from the altitude at which he operated, was what any of those numbers actually felt like. He did not know what it felt like to hold a part you had made with your own hands and know, without measuring it, that it was right. He did not know what it felt like to have built something slowly, carefully, over years, on a foundation of trust and reliability and the kind of reputation that cannot be manufactured by a marketing department. He did not know about Marcus Webb specifically when he signed the vendor termination order. That is perhaps the most chilling part of the story. Marcus was not a target. He was a line item. His Garage Webb Precision Components, 11 years of quiet excellence, appeared in the Calloway acquisition analysis as vendor ref number 4471, annual contract value $340,000, flagged for elimination as part of a Tier 2 vendor rationalization initiative. Someone had run the numbers and concluded that in-house production would recover the cost of termination within 18 months. The analysis did not include a column for what would be lost. Loss of that kind doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. Richard had signed the termination orders for 41 vendors in that single rationalization sweep. He had done it on a Thursday afternoon, between a board call and a dinner reservation, working through the stack of authorization pages with the focused efficiency of a man who equates speed of decision with quality of leadership. He had not read the individual vendor names. He had reviewed the aggregate numbers, confirmed they aligned with his projections, and signed. He was not malicious. He was merely indifferent, which, at scale, produces the same result. In the weeks that followed, Richard Calloway gave no further thought to the vendors he had terminated. He was focused on the integration timeline, on the capital expenditure approvals for the new in-house production facility, on the earnings call where he would present the rationalization as evidence of strategic discipline. The analysts were pleased. The stock moved favorably. His board offered what passed in those circles for enthusiasm. There was, however, one small technical problem, though Richard would not learn of it for months. The in-house production team, assembled quickly to meet the integration timeline, was struggling to replicate the tolerances that certain of the terminated vendors had been supplying. Specifically, a set of precision hydraulic components that went into a line of industrial equipment sold to 3 major clients. The internal team was producing parts that met the stated specification on paper. But in the field, over time, under real-world stress, the parts were performing differently. Not catastrophically, not yet. but differently enough that 2 of the 3 clients had flagged concerns in their quarterly feedback. Richard's operations team had noted the issue in an internal report. The report had been summarized, filtered, and presented to Richard as a minor quality calibration matter currently being addressed. He had nodded, moved to the next agenda item, and not thought about it again. The man who could have solved that problem, who had been solving exactly that kind of problem for 11 years, in a 4-bay garage on Route 9, for clients who had trusted him completely, was at that moment sitting across a kitchen table from his 8-year-old daughter, explaining in the careful, honest language he always used with her, that the garage was going to close and that things were going to be different for a while, but that different was not the same as bad. Lily had listened to all of it. Then she had looked at him with the particular gravity that certain children carry, the kind that makes you feel, in the presence of an 8-year-old, that you are the one being assessed. She had said, "But you still know how to make the parts, Dad. They can't take that." Richard Calloway, in his corner office, did not know that sentence had been spoken. He would spend the next 2 years learning what it meant. The factory had been empty for 6 years. It sat at the edge of a depressed industrial corridor 12 miles from Marcus's garage, a 34,000-square-foot concrete and steel structure that had once housed a mid-tier auto parts manufacturer before that company had moved production overseas and left the building to collect silence and property tax debt. The roof had 2 soft spots. 3 of the loading bay doors needed new hardware. The electrical panel was outdated and would require a full inspection before any serious machinery could be run. The floor drains were partially blocked. The heating system was functional in the technical sense that it would run, but inefficient in the practical sense that running it would cost more than the building's assessed value suggested was reasonable. Marcus walked through it on a gray February morning, 3 weeks after receiving the termination letter, with a legal pad and a flashlight and the calm, methodical attention he brought to every problem that was fundamentally mechanical. Because that is what this was at its core, a mechanical problem. A set of conditions that were suboptimal but not unfixable. A structure that had value underneath its deterioration. He had, after all, rebuilt a CNC milling machine from a seized spindle and 2 years of replacement parts sourced across 6 states. He knew what recoverable looked like. It looked like this. He had found the building through a county tax lien database, the kind of resource that appears in no business school curriculum but that a man researching with desperation and precision will eventually locate. The property had been listed for commercial sale twice in 6 years and had failed to close both times, once due to environmental review delays and once because the prospective buyer had pulled financing. The county was, at this point, primarily interested in recovering back taxes. Marcus had done the arithmetic 3 times before he allowed himself to believe it. The acquisition cost, structured as a tax lien purchase with a short-term private loan from a former client who believed in him unreservedly, was within the range of painful but possible. He signed the papers on a Thursday. He told no one except Lily, who celebrated by drawing a picture of the factory, a large rectangle with smoke coming from the top, which Marcus gently noted was not a feature the building currently possessed. She had added the smoke deliberately, she explained, because that meant it was working. He began the rehabilitation over the following 6 weeks, working nights and weekends while managing the final orders from the garage and the delicate, time-consuming process of renegotiating with the 3 clients who had not been absorbed by Calloway. Smaller firms, independent operators, men who had chosen Marcus specifically because they distrusted consolidated suppliers and valued the relationship they had with him. He was transparent with them. He was moving, the space would be larger, the capacity would be greater, there would be a gap of approximately 60 days, and he would hold their tolerances to the same standard they had come to expect. All 3 stayed. One of them, a hydraulics engineer named Pat Okafor who had worked with Marcus for 4 years, offered to lend 2 of his maintenance staff for 2 weekends to help with the electrical work. Marcus had accepted and had felt in that moment the specific warmth of being known by people who see you clearly. The machinery acquisition was where Marcus's 11 years of industry relationships became something more than professional history. They became infrastructure. He knew which equipment dealers held quality inventory. He knew which bankrupt manufacturers were liquidating assets that had been maintained by people who cared. He sourced a second CNC machining center from a closed job shop in Indiana, newer than his original, a model he had studied for 3 years without ever expecting to own. at a liquidation price that reflected the dealer's urgency more than the machine's value. He serviced it himself, with Lily occasionally present on the weekend, sitting on a borrowed stool, handing him tools with the solemnity of a surgical assistant. He hired 3 people. Not quickly, not casually. He hired the way he machined, precisely, with attention to what was actually needed rather than what looked impressive. The first was a former colleague from his Columbus days, a tool and die specialist named Raymond who had been laid off in a broader industry contraction and who was, Marcus knew, one of the finest manual machinists still working in the region. The second was a young woman named Sarah, 26 years old, who had a 2-year technical degree and an instinct for quality inspection that reminded Marcus, with a pang of recognition, of himself at that age. The third was a part-time operations coordinator, a practical, unflappable woman named Diane who had run the back office of a manufacturing firm for 16 years, and who, when Marcus explained what he was building, had said only, "When do you need me to start?" The factory opened quietly, without announcement, without a ribbon or a press release, on a Monday in late April. Marcus arrived at 5:45. Raymond arrived at 6. Sarah arrived at 6:10 with a thermos and a notebook. Diane arrived at 8 with a filing system she had already designed. The first machine ran at 8:30. The first part came off the line at 9:14, a hydraulic fitting for Pat Okafor's firm, machined to a tolerance of plus or minus 1.5 thousandths of an inch. Marcus measured it 3 times. It held. He set it on the workbench and looked at it for a long moment. This small, silver, precisely made thing that represented 11 years of knowledge and 6 weeks of rebuilding and a decision made in grief and love on a Tuesday morning with a peanut butter sandwich in his chest pocket. Then he picked up his phone and called Lily, who was at school, and left her a voicemail that said only, "The smoke is coming out of the chimney, Bug, just like you drew it." The call came on a Wednesday, 5 months after the factory opened, at 7:18 in the morning. Marcus was already at the floor when his phone rang. Standing at the inspection station reviewing overnight output from a new automated run he and Raymond had calibrated the previous afternoon. He answered without looking at the screen, the way a man answers when he expects the call to be routine. It was not routine. The voice on the other end belonged to a procurement director named Joel Strand, from a mid-sized industrial equipment manufacturer called Harwick Systems, a company Marcus had approached twice in the previous year, once before the Callaway termination and once after, with no meaningful response either time. Harwick was not a small company. It was not the kind of account that came to a 4-bay garage or even, ordinarily, to a 34,000 square foot factory that had been operating for 5 months. But Joel Strand was calling now, and the reason he was calling told Marcus everything about the fragility that hides inside Consolidated Systems. Callaway's in-house production facility had failed a critical quality audit. The hydraulic components, the very components that Marcus had once supplied, through the firms Callaway had absorbed, had been flagged by 2 of Harwick's engineers after a field performance review. The parts were within specification. On paper, they were fine. But within specification and correct are not always the same thing. And the engineers at Harwick, who had been working with precision hydraulics long enough to trust their instincts over their instruments, had flagged something that the spec sheet couldn't capture. The parts were performing inconsistently under thermal cycling. Not failing. Not yet. But trending toward failure in a way that made careful engineers uncomfortable, and made procurement directors make early morning phone calls to suppliers they had previously not considered urgent. Joel Strand had gotten Marcus's name from Pat Okafor, who had given it with the unambiguous endorsement of a man who has staked his own reputation on a referral. Marcus listened. He asked 4 questions, specific technical questions about cycling frequency, operating temperature range, material spec of the mating components, and the exact nature of the inconsistency the engineers had observed. Joel Strand answered each one, and with each answer Marcus felt the problem assembling itself in his mind the way problems always assembled themselves. Not as a crisis but as a puzzle, already partially solved by the simple act of being clearly defined. He told Joel Strand he would have a sample run ready in 10 days. Joel had said they needed it in 7. Marcus said he would have it in 6. He put the phone down and stood at the inspection station for a moment, looking at the floor, at the machinery, at Raymond running a morning check on the second machining center, at Sarah setting up the inspection board for the day's production schedule. He did the arithmetic. 6 days. A new client. a component profile he knew well but had not produced in this facility. A quality standard that Callaway's entire consolidated operation had failed to meet. What he did not say to anyone, what he held quietly in the interior space where he processed things before they became speakable, was that this moment was the one he had been building toward, and that it was also the one that could dismantle everything he had rebuilt if he reached for it wrong. Because the crisis was not only technical, it was financial. The Harwick order, if won, would represent a contract volume that would require Marcus to accelerate his equipment investment by at least 8 months. He had a private loan at a rate he was managing carefully. He had a payroll he was meeting comfortably but not luxuriously. He had a factory that was 5 months old and had not yet been tested at the kind of volume and precision standard this order demanded simultaneously. Any manufacturer with more experience and growth would have recognized the pattern. The opportunity that arrives at exactly the moment when your capacity is at its most vulnerable, when saying yes means committing everything and saying no means confirming the ceiling others have already imagined for you. He said yes. He had always been going to say yes. But the yes cost something. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with Lily, who was doing homework, a worksheet on fractions that she had strong opinions about, and Marcus helped her with the denominators while carrying the weight of the next 6 days in the quiet part of his mind. He did not tell her about Harwick. She was 9 years old and her fractions were more pressing. But at some point, without prompting, she looked up from the worksheet and studied him with that particular assessment he had come to recognize. The look she gave him when she was reading something in his face that he hadn't said out loud. She said, "Is something hard happening at the factory?" He considered lying. Not a serious consideration. He didn't lie to her, had made a private commitment to that when she was very small. But he considered the shape of the truth he would offer. He said, "Something important is happening, and I need to do it very carefully." She nodded with the gravity of someone receiving a report that confirms what they already suspected. Then she looked back at her worksheet and said, in a voice that was almost offhand, the way children deliver their most important lines, "You're always careful, Dad." He sat with that for a moment. Then he finished helping with the fractions, washed the dishes, and went back to the factory at 9:30 in the evening to begin. He worked until 2 in the morning. Raymond came in at midnight without being asked. Sarah arrived at 5 with the thermos and the notebook and said nothing except, "Where do you need me?" Which was the only thing that needed to be said. 6 days. Everything on the line. A CEO who had dismissed him somewhere in a building he'd never visited. And a 9-year-old girl who had told him, without fanfare and without doubt, the most useful thing anyone had said to him in years. The parts were ready in 5 days. Not because Marcus had rushed them, he had not rushed them, would not have rushed them, understood at a cellular level that rushing a precision component is not efficiency but erasure of everything that makes it worth making. They were ready in 5 days because he had done what he always did when a problem was clearly defined and the stakes were real. He had removed everything unnecessary and worked with complete attention inside what remained. No wasted motion. No hedged decisions. No second-guessing the instincts that Don Heller had told him decades ago could not be taught. He had also solved the thermal cycling problem. The inconsistency Harwick's engineers had observed in the Callaway-produced parts was something Marcus had identified within the first hour of analyzing the component specifications. A material pairing issue so subtle that it would not appear in a standard quality audit but would manifest, over time, under the specific stress conditions of Harwick's equipment. The Callaway production team had been working from the spec sheet. Marcus had been working from the physics. They were not the same document. He had machined the sample run to a surface finish tolerance that exceeded what Harwick had requested, using a toolpath geometry he had developed over years of working with similar material pairings in aerospace-adjacent applications. He had also written a 2-page technical note, unprompted, unasked for, explaining exactly what had caused the inconsistency in the previous supply chain, what he had done differently, and why his approach would hold under the thermal conditions Harwick's engineers had flagged. He had written it in plain language, without jargon, the way he explained things to Lily, not simplified but clarified. He sent the sample parts and the technical note to Joel Strand on a Friday morning. Joel called back that afternoon. He put Marcus on a conference call with 2 of Harwick's engineers, the same ones who had flagged the thermal inconsistency. They asked him questions for 40 minutes. And Marcus answered every one of them with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who is not performing knowledge but simply describing what he knows. At one point, one of the engineers said, with the kind of unguarded respect that engineers extend only to other engineers they recognize as genuine, "This note you sent, this is exactly what we've been trying to articulate for 3 months and couldn't get our own supplier to engage with." Marcus said, "The part told me. You just have to be willing to listen to it." There was a brief silence on the call, and then the kind of quiet consensus that doesn't require words. Harwick Systems became Webb Precision Manufacturing's largest client. The contract, signed 3 weeks later, was structured for 12 months with a renewal option and a volume commitment that required Marcus to bring on 2 additional machinists and accelerate the equipment investment he had been managing carefully. He did both. He hired the machinists with the same deliberate precision with which he hired everyone. Not quickly, not impressively, but correctly. The equipment loan was restructured by the same private lender, who had, by this point, developed the kind of confidence in Marcus that comes not from collateral but from having watched a man's judgment prove sound repeatedly under pressure. The factory, Webb Precision Manufacturing, as it was now formally incorporated, grew without drama. It grew the way good things grow. Not by announcement but by accumulation, one correctly made part at a time, one relationship deepened by reliability, one engineer telling another engineer that there was a shop on an old industrial corridor that did something the large consolidated suppliers had stopped being able to do, which was hold a tolerance and explain why it mattered. By the end of the second year, Marcus had 14 employees, 3 primary clients, and a waiting list. Richard Callaway became aware of Webb Precision Manufacturing through an industry contact who mentioned, in the context of a discussion about the Harwick supply chain correction, that a small independent shop had solved a quality problem that Callaway's own facility had created. Richard's operations director had followed up, and the resulting internal report, which landed on Richard's desk 7 months after Harwick had made its switch, noted that the shop in question had originally been a Callaway vendor, terminated in the Tier 2 rationalization initiative. Richard had read that line and sat with it for a moment longer than he usually sat with anything in a report. He did not reach out to Marcus. He did not need to, and Marcus did not need him to. But the internal quality review that followed, the one that eventually led Callaway to restructure its entire vendor strategy, reintroducing independent precision suppliers rather than relying solely on in-house production, bore, in its reasoning and its outcome, the unmistakable shape of a lesson taught by a man who had never stood in a boardroom. Marcus learned about the Callaway restructuring from Pat Okafor, who had heard it from a procurement contact, who had read it in the same trade journal that had once reported Marcus's termination as a routine consolidation decision. Marcus read the article once. He did not feel triumphant. That is important to understand. He felt something quieter, the specific satisfaction of a man who has been proven right by the work itself, without requiring anyone to acknowledge it. He folded the journal, set it on the corner of his desk. Then he walked out onto the factory floor, where Raymond was running a production check and Sarah was updating the inspection board, and the 2 new machinists were at their stations with the focused attention of people who take their work seriously. And he stood there for a moment in the noise and warmth of a functioning factory, his factory, and felt something that he would later, when Lily asked him what the best day at work had felt like, describe simply as right, not victorious, not vindicated. On a Saturday in October, 2.5 years after the notice had been taped to the garage door with 2 strips of blue painter's tape, Marcus Webb took his daughter to the factory. Not for any particular reason. Not for a milestone or a celebration or a lesson he wanted to impart. Lily was 11 now, and she had been to the factory before. On weekends when school was out and the babysitter wasn't available, she would sit in the break room with a book and a snack and emerge periodically to watch the machines with the same focused, unblinking attention she had always given them. She was comfortable there. She had a favorite stool near the second machining center, and Raymond had once, with great ceremony, allowed her to press the cycle start button on a non-critical run, which she had done with the gravity of someone launching a spacecraft. But on this particular Saturday, Marcus brought her with the specific intention of doing nothing together. The factory was closed, no production runs, no staff. Just the 2 of them in the quiet of the building, which had its own particular silence on weekends, different from the silence of any other large space Marcus had been in. It was not empty silence. It was resting silence, the silence of a place that had purpose and was simply between uses. Marcus had always found it peaceful in a way that was hard to explain. They walked the floor together, Lily occasionally touching the side of a machine with one flat palm the way she had seen her father do. Not to check anything, just to feel the presence of it, the realness of the metal under her hand. She asked him questions as they walked, the way she always asked questions. Not rapidly, not to fill silence, but one at a time with space between them, as if she was reading them from somewhere inside herself and selecting which ones were worth saying out loud. She asked him how you knew when a part was really right. He told her that you measured it and then you checked your measurements, and then if you had been doing this long enough you knew before you measured, the way you know a sentence is right before you read it back. She considered that for a long moment and then said, with the particular precision she had inherited from him in ways that still surprised him, "So it's like reading, except with your hands." He told her that was exactly right. She asked him if he missed the garage. He was quiet for a moment before answering, not because the answer was complicated, but because he wanted to give her the true one rather than the easy one. He said that he missed the smallness of it sometimes, the way everything had been close, but that what he had now was not better or worse than the garage. It was what the garage had been trying to become. The garage had always been too small for what was inside it. He had simply found it a larger shape. Lily looked at him when he said that. Not the assessing look, a different one. Softer. The look of a child who is filing something away for later, for the version of herself that will need it when she is older and standing in her own difficult morning. They sat on the floor near the inspection station and ate the lunch she had packed. Sandwiches, again, pressed flat with her palm, and 2 apples, and a small bag of crackers she had added because you need something crunchy or it's not really lunch. Marcus ate all of it, including the crackers, which he didn't particularly want but understood were part of the contract. She told him about school, a project she was working on, a conflict with a friend that had resolved itself through what she described as patience and also one direct conversation. A book she was reading that she thought he would like because the main character was quiet but kept solving things. He listened to all of it with the full, unhurried attention he gave her, the same attention he gave his work, because she was, in every meaningful sense, the reason the work was worth doing. At some point in the afternoon, she wandered to the far wall and stood in front of the thing he had hung there the week the factory opened. The crayon drawing she had made when she was 7 years old, the one from the garage wall, the man surrounded by silver circles she had called Dad's important rings. He had framed it properly now, a real frame, glass and all, and hung it at the center of the wall where the first thing you saw when you walked onto the floor was a child's drawing of a man doing what he loved. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she turned around and looked at him across the floor of the factory. This man who had received a notice on a Tuesday morning and had held it quietly and had rebuilt, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and she said something he would carry for the rest of his life. She said, "Dad, I always knew it would look like this." He did not ask her what she meant. He knew what she meant. She meant the factory, and she meant the life, and she meant the version of him that had been there all along, waiting for enough space to become visible. He looked at his daughter, 11 years old, standing in the factory she had drawn before it existed, and felt the full weight of everything it had cost and everything it had made, and found that the weight was not a burden. It was ballast. It was the thing that had kept him upright through all of it. He said, "I know, Bug. I know you did." And the factory held its resting silence around them, full of the particular piece of things that were built slowly, built truly, and built to last.